Hey, what's good, self-direct investors? I hope you're all doing great, and I want to welcome you back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Jordan. I'm the mind behind Make More Capital, and today we're coming at you with the midweek update in the world of cannabis. So before we jump in, if you enjoy this video or you learned something, please just leave a like on it as it really helps out my channel. And then of course, if you want to learn how to take advantage of this generational investment opportunity, subscribe below so that you don't miss any future videos. Then there's plenty of content for you to go back, rewatch, and educate yourself with. I've tried to put all the news and facts in one place so that you can watch episodes and learn about how the industry has evolved over time, identify top companies you keep seeing pop up, and then take advantage whenever you're ready. But we're going to start as cannabis sales slip a little bit in May after accelerated growth during a pandemic. Now, any industry that's growing, we love to see growth month after month, but we do know that every single month expecting growth is not sustainable. So it's good to see this offset a little bit. So we're going to go through the Western markets and the Eastern markets. In terms of Western markets, BDSA provides coverage for Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, and Oregon, and in April, growth ranged from 2.5% in Oregon to 49.9% in Nevada compared to a year ago. So if we look at Arizona, they transitioned to adult use sales in late January, but this is the second month that BDSA included adult use sales, and total cannabis sales grew 32% to 122.9 million from last year, with adult use representing 53.9 million. So as you can see, just a small gap down from April to May, but this is also due to medical cannabis sales falling 26% to 69 million because they just legalized for adult use, so you don't have to go to a doctor to get cannabis now. You can just go to the shop to get it yourself. But I think it's very important for us to contextualize it and compare April 2021 and May 2021 to April and May of last year. So clearly sales did go up that month, but then we saw from May to June come back down. So as we can anticipate, as we're seeing sales come back down, maybe next month they'll go back up, but regardless, sales are still strong. That's the main thing that we want to look at. If we go to California, annual sales grew 20.6% to 349.6 million, down 2% from a record level in April. Mind you, they're still very close to that record level, just under 350 million in a single month. And if we compare it to March 2020, where they hit a high peak after a fairly stable January and February, they came back down in April only to jump back up in May and level out around the same in June. So totally to be expected from these big states and these mature markets. Colorado, the mature market of Colorado, which has shown significant growth over the past year, hit a wall with sales of 201 million, growing only 3.8% from a year ago, as they declined 0.8% from April levels. But regardless, for a population of just 5.7 million people that has a lot of tourism, 200 million plus in cannabis sales in a single month is still great. And if we compare it to last year, again, they had a fairly stable January and February. March saw a big increase because people probably thought dispensaries were going to close and whatnot. Then April we saw a lull, jumped back up in May and then into June. So regardless, sales are still strong across the board. Nevada, facing a relatively easy comparison, sales in Nevada grew 49.9% to 87.4 million, but slipping 0.5% from April. So relatively the same amount that they sold last month, but if we compare to a year ago, after Nevada had to close and the lack of tourism definitely impacted that market, we could see it rebounded pretty strongly, and I have no doubt that sales are just going to continue as tourism resumes there. In Oregon, another mature market that had explosive growth following the pandemic, hit a wall in May too, with sales growing just 2.5% to 105.6 million, down 4.4% from April. Mind you, as we can see, they still managed over 100 million in sales, so the demand is still there and it's not slowing down. If we compare that to a year ago, sales continued to jump up, and it was actually after May where June saw a bit of a lull back down, and then as summer continued, sales continued back up. So not all bad. It's just normal for any market to sort of consolidate a bit before the growth continues. Now, if we look at the Eastern market, Illinois has not published their new figures. Typically, they're on the ball, and I've been following that, but because of the July 4th weekend, I imagine that they haven't updated that yet. So I'll likely have that on Sunday or next Wednesday. But Illinois, the only state to experience sequential growth across these tracked by BDSA, because again, they have such a fresh adult use market. Main thing though is that this is the same Illinois data as we saw last month. So not much change here, but all we can see is growth across the board. Mainly because of that fresh adult use legalization as of January 2020, which saw annual sales increase by 97.1% to 150.6 million, up 0.3 sequentially. So that went from 114 million to 116. Regardless, I'm going to wait for their new data to come out because I do still think it's going to be a strong month for them with a lot of out-of-state residents coming to buy. So we will see that when that gets reported. On to Maryland, though, sales declined for the second consecutive month, falling 1.9% 0.9% to 46.9 million. Legalized for adult use, Maryland, and you wouldn't have that issue. This represents annual growth of 21.5%, about half of the growth compared to their prior 2 months. So as we did see, their medical industry, again, they do not have legal adult use. It stayed flat and then dropped a little bit, but if we compare this to last year as well, we can see that in March and April it stayed relatively flat, jumped up in June, came back down, or jumped up in May, came back down in June. So totally normal for any market, especially if it's just medical and not for adult use yet. And then the last market, Massachusetts, while the comparison was tougher than April, May sales were depressed a year ago in Massachusetts due to adult use closures for most of the month. So compared to a year ago, sales in the state expanded by 257.1%. That sounds really good, to 122.5 million, and mind you, it is based on where we were a year ago, a decline of 4.9% from April. But Massachusetts was one of the few states to actually not deem recreational cannabis essential, so they closed that. But regardless, you can see the jump from April to May to June. And so as we see from April down to May, a little bit of a lull. That's totally normal in these markets. So just wanted to show that. Obviously, we would love to see growth every single month, but in terms of sustainability and long-term growth, we do want to see that natural ebb and flow of the markets. On to this, 2 takes of U.S. cannabis federal reform from Todd Harrison. Thank you for showing this, but I do not know who these snippets come from, so I just cannot reference exactly which investment firm they're from, but it seems like he's highlighting it that one is more of an optimistic view from Boris, saying that it's more left-leaning, and one is a more conservative view from CEO of Cresco Labs, Charlie Bachtell. It's a little bit more right-leaning, so let's just go through it. Federal level reform. The chairman expects the Schumer bill to be introduced in July based on recent conversations with the senator and his team. So this is referring to the Curaleaf outlook, the more optimistic one. After bill is introduced, there should be a 30-day comment period followed by negotiations to garner enough votes for the bill to pass. He believes it will be a compromise bill that will include banking reform, tax reform, i.e. either descheduling or rescheduling MJ so 280E would no longer apply, enough wording that would propel U.S. exchanges and the TSX to list U.S. plant-touching companies, i.e. uplisting MSOs from OTC pink sheets in the U.S., plus listing on the TSX in Canada versus only the CSE at present, while also including aspects of criminal reform and social justice. He also believes that if the bill passes both chambers, President Biden will sign it. The chairman argued that cannabis reform legislation is the biggest bipartisan issue in D.C. today. He also said that states are pressing the legislative branch to move on MJ reform. He thinks a good number of Republicans are supportive of banking reform. If the filibuster number is reduced to 5 instead of the current 10, the likelihood of passage would be even more likely, according to Boris Jordan. He does not expect the current compromise bill to federally legalize medical cannabis, expand the scope of retailing, or introduce interstate commerce. Interesting. That said, he thinks the bill could allow online retailer participation. So it seems like Amazon's getting really excited to join. Now for the more conservative outlook, still expecting slowness and regulatory catalysts. In New York, Cresco Labs expects MSOs to have cultivation canopy caps, although acknowledged incumbents and wholesalers would be advantaged, so that's good for Cresco Labs. Despite recent passage of legalization in Connecticut, management indicated the pressure on Pennsylvania to legalize would be insufficient for any change during this session. However, management expressed optimism the issue could be raised in the calendar 2020 session, which I think is better because we've seen a lot of states actually already legalize this year. Better to save a new batch for next year in the long term. And at the federal level, management does not expect anything meaningful to get passed this year, despite Senator Chuck Schumer's commitment to passing comprehensive reform. So they seem to make that last statement in terms of the reform bill, but they don't say anything about SAFE. And I think the one thing that they're missing from here is that New York, which legalized and plans to go full on with adult use next year, wants social equity, much like New Jersey and Connecticut, and social equity requires functional banking, according to Todd Harrison. So if they want functional banking, and if SAFE does actually have bipartisan support, like Curaleaf's perspective here, or Boris Jordan's perspective here highlights, then there's a good reason to believe that at least SAFE can pass to allow, the financial part of this to be set up in terms, or which would allow then in the next year for these new states to come online with that social equity that they sort of promised their constituents. So we know that it's a mess, but this is where we sit today. So again, very positive to at least expect some sort of change on the banking side for the second half of the year. Now, cannabis is projected to be a $70 billion market by 2028, yet those hurt most by the war on drugs lack access. So we're quickly going to learn about one entrepreneur's story. As a cannabis entrepreneur based in Long Beach, California, Edgar Cruz's work in the industry's social equity space is personal. At 15, Cruz had his first run-in with the law when he was arrested and charged for legal possession of cannabis. That charge, he tells CNBC Make It, has influenced his decision to not only be involved in the now legal market, but to also ensure that entrepreneurs like himself have access to the billion-dollar industry. And to see how lucrative the industry has become and who's profiting from these legalization changes versus who is still suffering because of the history behind it is very frustrating. And, as a Canadian watching this from up north, I think it's very frustrating too, because it's something that we've changed in Canada, but in the US it's just so complicated, so much more complicated, and therefore that much more difficult to make this change actually happen, says Cruz, who's been trying to get his cannabis brand X-Streep off the ground for 3 years now. But so I want to highlight that for anyone starting your own business, it's not easy to create a brand. It's not easy to make the time to get that brand to stand out and to build a community for that brand, and it's not easy to sustainably run that brand over time, because as any entrepreneur or anyone that's tried entrepreneurship, it's just not easy. It requires skills and it requires the ability to create a good team, and that requires managing humans, something that most humans are not very good at or don't have a lot of experience in. So it's not that simple, and sadly the people with the most capital did have that head start and are obviously the ones that have established cannabis companies. But this is why, as someone who realizes there's a big opportunity for investing, you can invest in these companies and grow alongside with them. So that's why, again, regardless of your skin tone, regardless of where you're from or your background, if you have the ability to save cash, then you do have the ability to open up a Roth IRA or a TFSA and start investing and take advantage in the similar way that these entrepreneurs are trying to do so. In 2017, 81% of cannabis business owners in the US were white, 5.7% were Hispanic, 4.3% were black, and 2.4% were Asian. I imagine these numbers look skewed, but compared to any other industry, I imagine it's, more likely a lot of the power is balanced in white hands, as opposed to being this distributed between Hispanic, Black, and Asian communities. Now, again, I don't know, I'm just saying this, but I just want to highlight that regardless of your background or your tone, you can take advantage in this time. So Cruz, along with several other equity advocates in the cannabis space, says the lack of diversity in the industry is at least partly due to the lasting impact of the war on drugs, which is so true. And while many cities and states have launched equity programs to try and close this gap, Cruz, who is a participant in Long Beach's Cannabis Social Equity Program, says these programs have often failed due to local government regulations and a lack of resources and capital for budding entrepreneurs. So that again highlights it's a very complicated situation, because local government regulations prevent probably a lot of minorities, especially anyone with a criminal record, from even getting involved, and then having a lack of resources or getting a lack of capital to start any business. That's such a trouble, especially because cannabis companies can't even work with banks. So just highlighting, yes, there has been so many difficulties, but again, now is the best time for anyone to consider taking advantage of the space, whether it's you wanting to start your own brand, your own business, or again, having cash and trying to buy assets that are going to accrue in value over time. So seriously, big shout out to the entrepreneurs out there that are trying to better themselves and take advantage of the situation, and to the self-directed investors like you out there that are actually putting in the time to do the research, buy assets, and wait, because that is how you end up building wealth over time. Now on to some news from the White House, as they declined to defend runners suspended from Olympics over cannabis tests while lawmakers step up. So this is not even surprising anymore. The White House on Friday declined to condemn a U.S. Olympics panel for suspending a famed sprinter over a positive test for cannabis, adding another level of frustration for advocates who have sharply criticized the administration for firing its own staffers over cannabis use. And I did want to add that she was also left off of the U.S. Olympic team for the 4x100 meter relay. So again, they're trying to punish them, but it's more of just a big L for Team USA, and it's really their loss that they're not going to have, her abilities. Meanwhile, a bipartisan group of members of Congress spoke out against the penalty on the athlete. So although the White House does not have any integrity or backbone, it's good to see that some other members of Congress do, as Reps Jamie Raskin and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, wrote a letter to USADA and the World Anti-Doping Agency expressing dismay at the punishment. The ban on cannabis is a significant and unnecessary burden on athletes' civil liberties. The two lawmakers, who are respectively the chair and vice chair of the House Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, wrote, divergent treatment of recreational alcohol and cannabis use reflects obsolete stereotypes about cannabis products and a profound misunderstanding of the relative risks of both substances, they said, which is absolutely true, as alcohol is far more dangerous, noting that major league sports such as NFL, MLB, and NBA are making moves to scale back or eliminate cannabis punishments for players. We're also concerned that this continued prohibition of cannabis, while your organizations allow recreational use of alcohol and other drugs, reflects anti-drug laws and policies that have historically targeted Black and brown communities while largely condoning drug use in white communities, they say. Absolutely true. And so as we notice, we can see a lot of the other people, other lawmakers that criticize the suspension on social media posts, and they all happen to be the cannabis-friendly ones too. Ron Wyden, Cory Booker, Matt Gaetz, AOC, Earl Blumenauer as well. So it's good to see that some congressional members still have a backbone and are willing to stand for something, even if, the president in the White House is not. But on to this development from the World Health Organization. This does seem to be a study that found out what we'd actually seen previously, but, hopefully more studies and more results like this will get the news out there. But cannabidiol inhibits SARS-CoV-2 replication and promotes the host innate immune response. So this is a big deal coming from the World Health Organization. Rapid spread of COVID underscores the need for new treatments, 100%. Here we report that cannabidiol, CBD, a compound produced by the cannabis plant, inhibits SARS-CoV-2 infection. Wow, that seems like a big deal, and I don't know why that's not news everywhere, or why this is not at least a call to more funding for more research on this topic. CBD and its metabolite 7,0-HCBD, but not congeneric cannabinoids, potentially block SARS-CoV-2 replication in lung epithelial cells. Now, CBD acts after cellular infection, inhibiting viral gene expression and reversing many effects of SARS-CoV-2 on host gene transcriptions. CBD induces interferon expression and upregulates its antiviral signaling pathway. But get this, a cohort of human patients previously taking CBD had significantly lower SARS-CoV-2 infection incidence of up to an order of magnitude relative to matched pairs or the general population, which basically means anyone that was taking CBD with the metabolite 7,0-HCBD in it every single day was less likely to get an infection from the virus than someone that was not. This seems like a big deal and is a reason for a call to action for more funding so that we can get more research and more conclusive results on studies like this. So the study highlights CBD, its active metabolite 7,0-HCBD, as potentially preventative agents and therapeutic treatments for SARS-CoV-2 at early stages of infection. So I think this is news worth sharing. But then I do got to show you this technicality on this page, which just explains the complicated nature of any system once you get into it, and this would be the system or the method of getting scientific studies or journals approved. It seems like a ridiculous process, and it is, and I'm just going to show you why. Because as much as this is news and this is information people should get, it's not going out there, mainly because it has to go through this process first. Preprints are preliminary research reports that have not been certified by peer review. Okay, but I still think I want to trust the credibility of all these researchers. I'd rather do that than not, but okay. They should not be relied on to guide clinical practice or health-related behaviors, and should not be reported in news media as established information. Okay, but I think this is worth, at least communicating out there so that people are aware of this so that we can get more funding into more studies like this, because I think the benefits or the results of this study have more benefits than not. Regardless, though, preprints posted online allow authors to receive rapid feedback, and the entire scientific community can appraise the work themselves and respond appropriately. What the hell does the scientific community, the entire community, know about cannabis or CBD and this complicated plant? This is so ridiculous because it's like, okay, we have these findings from these researchers that are pretty confident and, promising, but we need to share it with the entire scientific community so that they can come to their own understanding and respond appropriately. Like, why does that even matter? We have the results from researchers. Why can't we further study this? And then those comments are posted alongside the preprints for anyone to read them and serve as post-publication assessment. Now, look, I'm not in academia, so I don't know much about this whole peer-reviewed process. I mean, I've done the research and I've listened to podcasts that explain certain things. So don't take me as an adamant person on this. All I'm saying is I'm criticizing the fact that, why is this information not being spread out there when if you actually Google the problem with peer review, there seems to be many problems with it. And an even bigger issue is that peer review may be biased. Reviewers can usually see the names and the authors of their institutions, and multiple studies have shown that reviews preferentially accept or reject articles based on a number of demographic factors. No doubt. Peer-reviewed, a flawed process at the heart of science. The mess that is peer review and what should be done. The limitations to our understanding of peer research. Let's stop pretending peer review works. Peer-reviewed scientific journals don't really do their job. Problem with peer review. 4 ways peer review is broken. 6 common flaws to look out for in peer review. Which makes total sense. If you come up with some research findings, why do you have to go share it with everyone else to share their opinion who's just going to go, well, I don't know anything about cannabis, so this can't be true. No doubt that happens, so I just wanted to get that out there. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you are part of the scientific community or in academia, let me know what you think as well. I could be totally wrong, but I just think this information from the World Health Organization is worth sharing, but the fact that it's a preprint, so it cannot even be reported in news media as established information, So therefore, I'm just reporting it as results, maybe not established info, but that's what we have to deal with when trying to introduce cannabis findings and science to the rest of the community that doesn't know anything about cannabis. On to news from Curaleaf as Curaleaf International secures complete GMP certification of second EU GMP facility in Europe. So they're happy to announce that Medalchemy, the group's good manufacturing practice GMP certified manufacturing site in Alicante, Spain, has secured approval from the Spanish health authorities to import, manufacture, and export medical cannabis flowers. This is a big deal for the first U.S. MSO outside of the U.S. Medalchemy now has fully integrated cannabis supply facilities with a license to import, cultivate, extract, manufacture, and export medical cannabis flower and extracts commercially, as well as license to produce medical cannabis flowers and extracts for investigational and research purposes. This will allow the group to expand its existing supply of medical cannabis across Europe, a market which, according to Prohibition Partners, is expected to be valued at $3.2 billion by 2025, although it is much smaller than that now, and Curaleaf expects the total addressable European market to be $120 billion in time. So keep in mind, Curaleaf International is not a part of Curaleaf. It is a separate entity, but hopefully in time they will uplist onto some exchanges and we can get into that. But that is great news for Curaleaf, at least. On to Texas GOP cannabis activists push governor to support further reform during special session this week. So just wanted to highlight this because it's typically not who we hear from. As Republican cannabis activists in Texas, that's a string of words you don't typically see together in the same sentence, are calling on the governor to put forth expansions to the state's medical cannabis program on the agenda for a special legislative session he's convened for this week. As Governor Greg Abbott signed legislation last month to moderately expand the medical cannabis law by adding qualifying conditions and slightly increasing the THC limit for cannabis products, Republicans Against Cannabis Prohibition is hoping to see further action during the session that starts this Thursday, because specifically they're urging the governor to use his unilateral authority to place on this session agenda measures that would allow regulators to add even more qualifying conditions for patients such as chronic pain, which cannabis helps with the most, and to further adjust the THC limit. So the group is circulating a petition supported by Texas NORML and Texans for Responsible Cannabis Policy to build pressure on the governor to call for cannabis reforms. So far, it has more than 4,000 signatures out of its goal of 6,400. So as the governor of Texas, only you decide what can be on the agenda for the special session. It says, please use medical cannabis to the agenda and help save lives in Texas. As I previously reported, this is a good small win, but allowing, cannabis for chronic pain or medical cannabis for chronic pain would be big for everyone in Texas. I'm glad that the activists there are pushing. While in South Dakota, cannabis activists unveil 4 legalization initiatives for 2020 ballot, pending the Supreme Court decision. So, if South Dakota Supreme Court declines to overturn a February ruling that nullified a voter-approved cannabis legalization initiative, activists are going to go all in on a one ballot initiative process again to ensure that the reform is enacted by 2022. And this is a big deal because South Dakota voted on the ballot in November to legalize, but then the Supreme Court of South Dakota overturned that for some ridiculous technicality, which should not be allowed because clearly the people want this, so they're fighting to ensure that if they don't get this turning overruled, then they're going to be ready to go in 2022. Last week, they filed 4 separate legalization measures with the State Legislative Research Council, the first step towards putting the issue before voters next year. South Dakotans for Better Cannabis Laws say the sponsor will drop the proposals if Amendment A, which was approved by voters last November, is fully restored by the state's high court. But for now, they're getting the process rolling in case the judiciary doesn't uphold the will of the electorate, which they should uphold the will of the people. For whatever reason they don't, then that's not a very effective, democratic system. But regardless, the 4 initiatives share some basic provisions, but they each take a unique approach to the policy change. So all that to say is that the people are preparing themselves so that if the Supreme Court fails them again, then the people are going to take it into their own hands and get this done effectively. And then there's also a 5th measure that the group is backing, which would eliminate the single subject rule for the ballot process, the policy that led to the state judge deeming the 2020 measure unconstitutional in the first place. So on top of the 4 initiatives, they have a 5th one that will remove that technicality that allowed a judge to deem the 2020 recreational measure unconstitutional. So big ups on the people of South Dakota for doing this. I'm proud to be a sponsor of these initiatives because they represent the will of the voters. Melissa Mantell, who spearheaded a separate medical cannabis legalization initiative that was overwhelmingly approved by voters last year, said in a press release, South Dakotans support cannabis legalization. If Amendment A is repealed, then we need to be prepared to put legalization on the ballot again. So it's the people taking it into their own hands, not waiting on the leaders in their state to to come to any sort of conclusion that doesn't fit with what they want. And on top of that, Missouri medical cannabis sales jobs grow as after 8 months as the legal industry continues to see growth. And so we look at Robert Sullivan, who's the co-owner of Fresh Green Dispensary. Our patient list, we have probably over 10,000 different patients that we have served in this time. Sullivan said his own perceptions of who is a patient has changed in the 8 months of business. Yeah, no doubt, because typically expectations don't meet reality. When we opened, we had a sort of impression of what we thought was going to be. Turned out to be completely different. We have an average age of patients in the 50s. As Fresh Green is one of 125 dispensaries in the state of Missouri, in the months since dispensaries began operating, there are more than 120,000 documented medical cannabis patients, and the industry is responsible for 3,500 jobs, with sales surpassing 70 million according to MoCan Trade, an association of business owners, healthcare providers, patients, and residents wanting a compliant medical cannabis program in Missouri. And coming from a bud tender, one person who found the job in this budding industry is Logan Shute, a bud tender at Fresh Green Dispensary. With COVID, I actually got laid off in the warehouse industry, searched around, found them, and got lucky and got in on here, Shute said. Shute said it's an industry with high potential for job security, right? Go find a gig in this industry if you haven't already, or move to a state where it's available. This is the type of industry that's going to grow no matter what, he said. That's awesome. The work for Shute is rewarding. He says he feels like he's helping patients get off opioids and can see the difference in patients who walk through the door. Imagine that. People got one reality for Americans living with access to recreational and medical cannabis, and a completely different, more hellish reality for those that don't. It literally makes them have a new outlook on life, Shute said. It makes them more positive and able to see that I don't have to be in pain all day. It makes you wonder why this plant was illegal for so long, right? This amazing plant with all these therapeutic benefits. On to Canada, 5 key takeaways from the Ontario Annual Cannabis Report. So you can grab the report here. Actually, we're going to jump to it in a moment just to highlight a few things, but we're going to walk through it. Legacy markets stubbornly persist as the OCS estimates that 44.1% of the province's cannabis sales come from the legal market by the fiscal fourth quarter, which means 56% are still coming from the illegal market. So that's definitely a difficult task to try and take market share away from, but I think this has to do with a big part of making sure that you're getting locations, retail locations in these rural communities as well, not just the cities. And then they say store closures are probably coming. Again, highlighting that yes, in certain city blocks in Toronto and Ottawa, you've got 5 stores opening up on the same street corner, which is just terrible market research by the entrepreneurs that are opening up these shops. Really, and that's the hard part, because if you want to actually properly supply the demand, you want to go to almost a rural area and open up a store there. But who wants to move from a nice convenient location to somewhere in the middle of nowhere to open up a shop? That's sort of the trade-off. But as much as they say store closures are probably coming, we're going to see a few probably relocate to different areas where they can properly supply the demand. But if you have 4 or 5 cannabis shops in one downtown block, that's just bad market research from the people that open the shops. Prices keep dropping. That's a good thing. That's going to help us take market share away from the illegal market over time. So that's good to see. Flower continues to dominate. So as I've highlighted, with Texas trying to get chronic pain as one of those instances added to where medical cannabis is allowed for, because chronic pain seems to be the most common thing that people have to deal with, and it seems to be the best thing that cannabis helps relieve the suffering from. So that's one instance where it just goes to show that flower is always going to dominate, because at the end of the day, good old flower always does the trick and helps, relieve whatever suffering, relax whatever worries, helps you go to sleep, whatever sort of resolve that you're looking for. Flower can typically help you get that. And does anyone like pot drinks? This is a whole other mess in itself, but in Canada, you can only buy 5 pot drinks at a time, whereas you can buy as many individual beers as you could possibly imagine, all because you cannot buy more than 30 grams at a time, and in 5 pot drinks, technically 30 grams of cannabis go into 5 pot drinks. So it's ridiculous. That's a whole conversation in itself, but seems like Canada is healthily growing, even if it's at a much smaller pace than the US. Now, I did want to dig into this report just for a few things. So if we jump down here, and this is looking at April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. So for the whole year, this is just the month of Ontario. But the main takeaways is just to highlight why you need to open retail stores. Because people want to shop from brick and mortar locations. They want to go in there and they want to learn what they're buying. They don't want to buy from the government online. So this just goes to highlight how much more sales is coming from retail stores in Ontario than from online through the government shop. And then again, here we see that there is a lot more of the black market that these shops can continuously take market share from. So it's good that Ontario continues to open 120 stores a month, and they will continue to do that. Then if we scroll down, I just wanted to highlight another big thing, the sales data. If we look here, where are most of the sales coming from? At the end of the day, still dried flower, with vapes taking a much bigger market share, and pre-rolls third behind there. So if we look at the breakdown, dried flower made up 59% of sales, with 411 million coming from retail stores and 68 million coming from the Ontario Cannabis Store. Vapes made up 16% with 81 million, and then 14 million, 4 million, and 5 million coming from the retail stores versus 14 million, 4 million, 1 million, and 1 million coming from the Ontario Cannabis Store. And then lastly, pre-rolls make up 12% with 89.9 million coming from retail stores, 6.9 million coming from the OCS. So this is why it's so important to open up stores, especially in these rural communities where you don't have as much access. Because if you open all the stores in the cities, then everyone in rural communities are just gonna turn to the legal markets. Just wanted to highlight that. And if we go down here, though, edibles and beverages, 4%, 2%. It's just not going to compete with flower, vapes, or pre-rolls. So the companies that chose to go with dried flower, vapes, and pre-rolls at the end of the day definitely got the better end of that stick. And lastly, this is an excellent podcast episode that I wanted to share with you from The Dime. The title is U.S. Cannabis, a Generational Wealth Opportunity, featuring Josh Rubin. So I'm just going to play it for a little bit. For a few minutes, I want you to listen and see what you get from this. But if you are a cannabis investor, I recommend that you definitely listen through this. It's a very valuable episode to listen to.
U.S. Cannabis is the great American growth story. It's a story of cash flow positive companies with high growth, a long runway for growth, great margins, limited license moats, a steadily decreasing cost of capital and risk premium, and a recession/pandemic proof business. These companies are currently trading at mid-teen EBITDA multiples. And if you compare that to consumer packaged goods companies, which are trading around 20 to 30 times EBITDA, and if you compare that to Canadian LPs that are trading close to 50 times 22 EBITDA, just from that perspective, they're significantly undervalued comparatively. Not to mention the U.S. cannabis industry is growing at a 20% growth rate for the next decade. So a conservative example to look at valuation, I would call it a base case, would be to look at the total addressable market by the year 2030, which is estimated to be at least 100 billion of retail sales. If you assume that the MSOs capture 75% of that, so assuming that they're selling 50% of their sales wholesale and 50% via retail, and you assume 25% EBITDA margins for that, a 20% market share leader in the United States trading at 40 times EBITDA could be valued at 150 billion. And right now, like we'll mention with Curaleaf is around 10 billion of EV. That implies a potential 15x upside, from the largest US operator today. So I think there's significant upside if you have the staying power and ability to kind of wait for this thesis to continue to evolve, for the companies to continue growing their earnings and eventually uplist onto a US exchange where investors will begin to pay a fair multiple for these companies.
And that sums up what I've been repeating week over week, and it's just very important to understand that patience plays a big role in successful investing. And like he highlighted there, you do have to have the patience to watch this thesis pan out, but then when you do, that is when you can get rewarded. And that's why I try to focus on the fundamentals. If when I say focus on the fundamentals confuses you a bit, then that is a good sign for you to try and learn about what the fundamentals are in the company, making sure that companies are profitable, learning about comprehensive income statements, balance sheets, and free cash flow statements. A great resource on YouTube is Daniel Pronk. If you go to his YouTube channel, he's got a breakdown on how to read cash flow statements, comprehensive income statements, and balance sheets. That's something I use. I would recommend checking it out. It's been a great, valuable learning tool. And just the more practice that you do learning fundamentals, watching videos about company analysis and things like that, it will just further develop your abilities to do that so that you can pick companies on your own. But that is it for this week's episode, folks. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Really hope you got some value out of this. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or concerns. But besides that, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it. Subscribe if you don't want to miss any future ones. And I will catch you on Sunday for This Week in Cannabis News. Have a great week, everybody.